The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District. He's also author of a brand new book, Doing Justice. It's worth noting in 2017, he was fired after he refused to follow Attorney General Jeff Sessions' request for all remaining U.S. attorneys appointed under President Obama to resign. And he's here in New York. I've got the book. Let's start and just pick up on what Tom had to say about some of the challenges that are facing anytime you're looking at a president. But we're also talking about potentially his family, his inner circle. What do you see as the biggest threats to Trump world right now?
I should just point out something before we talk about what those threats are. You know, we've just concluded, the special counsel just concluded a 2-year almost investigation, at the end of which he chose, with respect to the collusion issues, conspiracy issues, that there was not enough evidence to bring a case and to charge a crime. And on the obstruction side, such a close question that he sort of punted and didn't decide the issue. And so when people talk about these other investigations, I just hope people are not pinning their hopes because they dislike the president on these investigations, maybe causing his ouster from office. Bob Mueller comes out of the Justice Department. Obviously, the Southern District is part of the Justice Department. I ran it for 7.5 years. So with all these investigations, people are going to be looking at the facts. They're going to be fearless. They're going to be independent. But at the end of the day, they may yet yield no charges also. So I just want to make sure that people understand that.
Understood. But aren't these on very different topics than what was that limited mandate that Robert Mueller has? When you start talking about the business, when you start talking about real estate deals, when you start talking about hush money, those are not in Robert Mueller's direct purview.
No, absolutely. So the threats, legal jeopardy threats to Donald Trump and his associates and even members of his family have proliferated because, you know, Mueller found some things, reassigned some things to the Southern District of New York, namely the Michael Cohen case, and then you have offshoots from that. You know, in the same way that the reason we know about the college admissions scandal is not because they were investigating the college admissions scandal. They were investigating a particular executive on securities fraud. They flipped him, and he said, well, I got a story to tell you that's a much bigger deal. So that's what happens when scrutiny comes upon you by federal prosecutors and the FBI and agents. And so we don't even know if the items that you mentioned are the sum total of investigations that we'll ultimately be talking about in 6 or 8 months. Because what we know from the way the Trump Foundation operated, based on the New York Attorney General's investigation and its suit against the Trump Foundation, it was basically, in some ways, you know, the personal piggy bank of Donald Trump and his associates. The Trump organization also hasn't been managed well. So we don't know where it will lead. But what I can tell you from my time running that place, it'll be done fairly, it'll be done appropriately, it'll be done aggressively.
Will it be done expeditiously?
I think so. But, you know, as I say in the book, investigations take time, particularly white-collar investigations that involve flows of money, that involve potentially having cooperating witnesses, seeing where those leads take you, and sometimes you'll go down one path and it'll come up empty, but it'll lead you to some other path. You know, people have been complaining about the Mueller investigation for a long time. I think, you know, no reasonable person can say that concluding a complicated investigation with 30-some-odd people charged, a trial happening with respect to Paul Manafort, multiple people flipping, that to do that and have a report done in 22 months is too long. Sometimes an investigation can take 6 months. Sometimes it can take a year or two. I think folks will be mindful of the clock and make sure that they understand that they don't want to put a thumb on the scale with respect to any upcoming election. But they also have to take due and appropriate time to make sure they do the job right.
People who are looking, and frankly, a lot of Democrats at Trump directly and what SDNY might mean for him. Let's just talk about Cohen's cooperation, right? He pleaded guilty to 8 felony counts, hush money, campaign finance violations, and he said he was directed to commit those crimes by the president himself.
Yeah. So, you know, the clearest evidence that you have endorsed by, it seems, a court, not just Michael Cohen, and also by the Southern District of New York, is this famous statement that Michael Cohen made in a plea proceeding where he decided to admit guilt to a crime, is accepting responsibility for the crime, is going to prison because of that crime, campaign finance violation, which he said he did in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, the president. It leaves the question open of whether or not, if the president were someone not in the Oval Office, not in the White House, would he be subject to charges? I think we get very close to that. It's a little bit of a different matter to accept a guilty plea on a particular charge from someone who is already pleading guilty to other things versus going to trial against the United States president for the same crimes. And it also depends on how credible you find Michael Cohen as a witness. And, you know, he has some credibility problems. But, yes, that's a serious question.
I know you have to go, but I do want to ask you a final question about the Mueller report, the possibility of it coming out. And we were talking in the break, and you said there's no reason it would have to all come out at once. For example, what a lot of us have focused on is obstruction. Could they decide, okay, let's deal with the obstruction part of it first, release that? How realistic is it?
Yeah, so I just was listening to your very smart panel that preceded this conversation. I think it's very important that the public and Congress get a sense of what was in the Mueller report. And what I'm worried about is you have this 4-page summary that was done over a 48-hour period after a 2-year investigation. And people might be getting, a mildly, maybe not intentionally, but a mildly misleading sense of what the evidence was. On collusion, I feel like that's less important to become known. I don't mean to minimize it, but it clearly wasn't a close question for Robert Mueller. No charges forthcoming from that. To the extent people are concerned about grand jury information and classified information, my guess, this is just a guess, is that more of that is implicated in the part about collusion, given the nature of that investigation. Less of grand jury material, my guess, of grand jury material, classified information, might be implicated in the obstruction part. That, to me, is very important, the obstruction information becoming known to Congress and the public, because Bob Mueller had no qualms about charging people with obstruction crimes during the course of the investigation, but he found here that the evidence was so close, it's such a close question, that he decided not to answer the ultimate question of whether or not you could charge. I'd like us to know what that evidence was, what the evidence in favor of obstruction and the evidence that mitigated an obstruction charge was, and if it is the case that you can get to the bottom of that more quickly and redact whatever grand jury or classified information more quickly on that, I don't see why that can't come out before we get the whole thing.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.